In this third video of Unit 2, we're going to be looking at price indices. In particular, we're going to be defining what inflation is. We're going to be looking at one measure of how to calculate of inflation, the CPI, the Consumer Price Index. And then we're going to look at, well, who exactly does inflation help or hurt? All right, let's go. All right, so price indices. And so when we talk about price indices, really this entire video is going to be about inflation and how do we calculate or look at inflation within our country. And so inflation, right, our definition of it is just a general rise in prices and the reduction of purchasing power of money. I think this first part of this definition, the general rise of prices, is pretty self-explanatory, right? If milk costs $2 a gallon one day and all of a sudden the next week it costs $4, right? That is going to be inflation. But also, inflation can also mean the reduction of purchasing power of money, right? So in other words, right, what that means is that your dollar can no longer buy the same amount of goods that it did in the past. Right? That your dollar is worth less, hence the reduction of purchasing power of your dollar here. And that's what the second bullet point is trying to explain, right? When inflation occurs, each dollar is going to buy fewer goods than before. Hence, that is the reduction of purchasing power. And so in general, we're going to say high inflation is bad because whenever there is inflation, banks tend to not lend out money and people tend to not save, right? Because when prices are insanely high or higher because of inflation, right, people are spending more money, theoretically, right? And so when we have inflation, right, this decreases investment, which decreases our GDP. Because if you remember back to our first video, right, our GDP, which we're going to label as Y, equals consumer spending plus investment spending plus government expenditures or government spending plus, right, our net exports. And so here, if our investments are going to fall, well, if we're just looking at this mathematically with this equation, then our GDP is also going to fall here. And so if there is high inflation, theoretically, investments are going to fall. Remember, when we talk about investments, we're not talking about investing in stocks and bonds. We're talking about the investment in capital goods. And so if investment decreases, it stands to reason mathematically that our GDP is also going to fall as well. Well, the flip side of this, right, if there is inflation, well, there has to be deflation. Deflation are decreases in general prices or a negative inflation rate. Well, isn't deflation good then, right? If prices are going lower and lower and lower, isn't that good? Well, we're going to say deflation can be bad because people then hoard money and assets, right? Because goods are cheaper, right? They're not going to spend as much on goods and save the rest of it. And so yet again, right, if we're going back to our GDP equation, right, GDP equals C plus I plus G plus XN, when people hoard their assets, right, consumer spending is going to fall. Well, if one part of this equation, if consumer spending is going to fall, yet again, our GDP is going to fall as well. Lastly, right, we have inflation, we have deflation, and then we also have disinflation, which is prices are increasing, but at really slow rates. So in other words, it's inflation, but prices are rising at a slow rate here. And so how do we measure inflation? Well, there's two different ways. We're going to go over one way in this video, and in our next video, we are going to go over the second way of how we measure inflation. But generally speaking, we measure inflation by the government tracking the prices of specific market baskets that include the same goods and services. So in other words, what the government does is they look at the most commonly and popular bought goods, right? And they just track the prices of those goods from year to year. And so there are really two different ways that we can look at inflation over time. The first is the inflation rate. The inflation rate is just the percentage change in prices from year to year, right? So if something goes from $2 to $4, our inflation rate is going to be 100%. The other way is through something called price indices. And the indices is just an index number, right? So a number ranging from 0 to whatever, right? That shows how prices have changed relative to a specific base year. So in other words, with price indices, we're going to say this 1 year, we're going to choose a random year and say this 1 year is going to be the base year that we're going to compare all other prices and all other years to. And so to calculate our market basket, right? Well, first, you have to add up the price of all the items within the basket in a given year. And so the quantity in the basket, this is really important. The quantity in the basket has to be the same as the base year. So in other words, if you sold 5 of one of good A in the base year, and you sold 6 of good A in the second year, you can't have that, right? You always have to compare everything to the quantity in the base year. The quantity has to be the same as the base year here. And within our market basket, it's going to be only the items that consumers would normally purchase. And we're going to say that lets us calculate our consumer price index, or our CPI for short. And so let's practice a little bit of calculating the cost of the market basket. Remember, the cost of the market basket is just adding up all the goods within a particular year, or the price of all the goods within a particular year. So pause the video real quick, figure out the cost of the market basket for year 1, year 2, and year 3. All right, so let's go back together. So remember, part of our definition for cost of the market basket that we saw in the last slide was that the quantity of goods needs to be the same for all the different years that we're looking at. And so luckily within this guided practice, that's the same. For year 1, year 2, year 3, they're only buying a pound of apples, a pound of bananas, a gallon of milk. That isn't going to change, which makes it a lot easier for us. Well, for year 1, the cost of the market basket is just 2 plus 25 cents plus $1.75, which gets us to $4. So the cost of the market basket for year 1 is $4. Well, the cost of the market basket for year 2 is just 2 plus 50 cents plus $2.50, right, which gets us to $5. Well, for year 3, the cost of our market basket, as you could probably guess by now, is just $2.50 plus 75 plus $2.75, which gets us to $6. So pretty simple, right? And the reason we're able to add up 2 plus 25 cents plus $1.75 and so on and so on and so on is because we're only buying a pound, a gallon, right? So it says 2 pounds, 2 pounds, 2 gallons. We will need to multiply it, right, by 2 times 2, 25 times 2, 175 times 2, right, to get to the real cost of the market basket there. All right, so I hope this made sense. So we're going to move on now. So our consumer price index, or CPI for short, is the most commonly used measurement of inflation. And so how it works for us is that the base year, or the year that we're going to compare all other years to, is going to be given an index number of 100. And so it's important to note that base year is completely random, right? We can choose the base year to be 1939. We can choose the base year to be 1994. We can choose the base year to be 2016, right? It's whatever year we choose to be the base year, to be the basis, is always going to be given that index number of 100. And then to compare, each year before or after is going to be given an index number as well. And then after that, we just compare those two index numbers together. And so before we move on to an example of this, we first have to tell you or go over the equation to help calculate our consumer price index. Well, our CPI, or consumer price index, equals the price of the market basket, which we calculate in our guided practice before, divided by price of the market basket in the base year times 100 to get us to that index number. Right? So yet again, our CPI equals price of our market basket divided by price of our market basket in the base year times 100. So for example, right? So I already worked this out just so we could save a little bit of time. So here we have our 1997 market basket. Let's say there are only 2 items. The movie is $6 and our pizza is $14. So the total cost of our market basket, right, is going to be $20. And this is step one, right? Step one, our market basket is just the two items within our 1997 market basket, the $6 for movies and the $14 for pizza. Well, because we're going to say this is the base year, we can automatically say the index number is 100. However, let's just figure it out, right? Remember, our equation is our market basket, right, divided by the market basket in the base year. Well, here we already know the market basket is $20. If we're going to use 1997 as the base year, it's just 20 divided by 20 times 100, which gets us to the index number of 100. Well, let's say in 2009, right, that were the same quantity of movies, but now it's $8, the same quantity of pizza, but now it's $17. So the cost of the market basket in 2009 is now $25, as you can see in step one. Well, to calculate our CPI, remember, it's our market basket divided by the market basket in the base year, which is step two. Well, now in step three, right, we can sort of plug in our numbers. Well, in 2009, the cost of the market basket was $25 divided by the $20, which is the cost of the market basket in the base year, which gets times 100, which gets to step four, 1.25 times 100. So our index for our CPI index number for 2009 is 125. And so now all we do is just compare the two numbers together. In 1997, which is our base year, the CPI index was 100. In 2009, the CPI index is 125. What this means is it means that compared to our base year in 1997, in 2009, our prices increased by 25%. So that index number does not mean, that index number 125 does not mean that inflation rose or prices rose by 125%. The reason why we calculate the index number is to compare it to the base year index number, which is always going to be 100. So for 2009, instead of 125, let's say the index was 150. Well, that meant from 1997 to 2009, if the index is 150 now, that prices rose, inflation rose by 50%. All right, so now that we went over it, let's do a little bit of a guided practice here. So I want you guys to pause the video and figure out the CPI, the index number for year one, year two, year three, and we're going to use year one as our base year here. All right, so pause the video, figure out the CPI for each year, and then we'll move on. All right, so let's go over this, right? So I gave you the answer, or gave you the cost of the market basket, right? 4, 5, 6, we already did that. But now we're supposed to figure out the cost of the market, the CPI index number. Remember, to figure that out again, it's just the price of the market basket over market basket in our base year, right? And we're going to multiply that times 100. So if we're going to use year one as the base year, we're automatically going to say that the index number is 100, right? Because we're just going to do 4 divided by 4 times 100, right? Which gets us to 100. All right, so pretty simple. Well, for year two, well, we know, right, for year two that our market basket is $5, right? So our market basket is $5. We know that the market basket in the base year is $4, right? So we get 5 over 4 times 100, which gets to 1.25 times 100, which gets us to 125. Well, for year three, right, we're going to do the same thing. The cost of the market basket is $6, right? The cost of the market basket in the base year, which yet again, remember, is year one, is $4. And then we're going to multiply it by 100. So that gets us to 1.5 times 100, which gets to an index number of 150. And so here, right, from year one to year two, there was 25% inflation. From year one to year three, there was 50% inflation. We cannot say from year two to year three, we can't just look at 125 to 150 and say there was 25%, right? When we look at these index numbers, right, we're always comparing it to the base year. So we can compare year one to year two, we can compare year one to year three, and just look at the difference between the index numbers there. But if we want to compare year two to year three, a non-base year to a non-base year, we cannot just subtract, right? 150 or 125 from 150, right? We can't say there was 25% inflation. And so in the next video, we're going to go over, well, how do we actually figure that out? I just wanted to let you guys know you just can't compare or subtract 150 from 125 and say there was 25% inflation from year 2 to year 3. Well, now that you guys know how to calculate CPI, well, what are some problems with the CPI? Well, there are 3 big problems. 1, substitution bias. 2, new products. And lastly, the product quality itself. So 1, substitution bias. Well, here, if Coca-Cola is in our market basket and the price of Coca-Cola increases and people turn to a substitute Pepsi, because Pepsi is not included in our market basket, that is going to change our index number, right? So our CPI does not take into account when people buy substitute goods. Which leads us to number 2. The CPI also does not take into account when consumers buy new goods, right? When the iPhone first came out in like 2007, that was a new product and was not included within the market basket. And so because of that, all the sales and all the consumers that were buying iPhones were not included within the CPI itself. Remember, the CPI only measures, or the market basket only really measures, the most commonly popular goods from year to year. And so new products can't be really common, right? Because it's new. And lastly, product quality. Our CPI doesn't really measure the quality of products that are bought, only the most commonly bought products, right? So quality of products is also something that our CPI doesn't measure, which we can say is a problem with our CPI. All right. And so the last section that we're going to go over is cost of inflation. And so we're going to go over who is hurt and who is helped by inflation. And so we're going to say that these 3 people right here, lenders, people with fixed incomes, and savers, are all hurt by inflation. So if we have a general rise in price levels, lenders are hurt, but only banks or people who lend money at fixed interest rates. So if you get a fixed interest rate at 3%, right, but we have 10% inflation, the money that you're getting back is actually less, right? It's less purchasing power. And because of that, lenders are hurt. People with fixed incomes, people's incomes do not change based on inflation, right, are also hurt because your income is going to buy less and less and less with inflation there. And lastly, savers. If you just save your money, you are also going to be hurt by inflation. Well, on the flip side, right, borrowers, people who borrow money, yet again, at fixed interest rates, are helped by inflation because they're paying back their loans with technically less dollars. And lastly, businesses, where the price of the product increases faster than the price of resources, right? And so businesses are also helped by inflation because they're technically, right, gaining more profit because they're not paying as much for the resources anymore while they're charging higher prices to account for inflation here. And so there's a difference between the words nominal and real, right? And so in this case, we're going to add the term wage after it. So nominal just means, right, that you're not taking into account inflation. So nominal wage is just wage measured by dollars rather than purchasing power. In other words, right, nominal wage is your wage just at the end of the day without taking into account inflation. However, whenever you see the word real in front of it, like real wage, that is wages adjusted for inflation. So the same thing could be true for nominal GDP and real GDP, right? Nominal GDP is GDP that does not take into account inflation. Real GDP is GDP that takes into account inflation here. And so when we talk about cost of inflation, there are other different problems with it. The first is menu costs, right? Whenever there is inflation, right, there's extra cost to businesses, right? Businesses have to update their menus, their signs, etc., which costs businesses more money. Secondly, there are shoe leather costs, right? Cost of transactions increases. Whenever there is inflation, people reduce their real money holdings. In other words, they save less money in the bank because they have to spend time and effort to take out additional cash to help pay for the higher prices of goods because of inflation. And lastly, unit of account costs. Our money doesn't reliably measure the value of goods and services, right? Because there is inflation, there is a certain amount of uncertainty caused by the changes in currency value. Right? Because there is inflation, right? Our dollar, because it's not backed by anything, it's solely backed by our faith in our government, right? The value of our dollar can change. And so in that sense, our money isn't necessarily the most accurate measure of how valuable a good or service is. All right, so that's all I have for you guys today. I hope you guys learned a lot, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace.